Hi everyone, and welcome to today's video premiere. If you're watching live, please put your comments in the side over there. I'll be listening and watching and replying and responding to all those. If you're new to the channel, hi, g'day, my name is Phil. Steve will be doing the presentation today, so I'll be watching. Steve and his wife Katya over in Germany as we speak, so your prayers for their safe return back to Australia are most sought after. Steve's video today is one that tackles a bit of a controversial subject. You may agree, you may disagree, you may part agree. All open for discussion, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and your comments below. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. You've got that button over there. You could like the video, that's always appreciated. And when you do subscribe, please hit the bell, the ding on the side, so you can get notifications when they come through. If you have already subscribed and you're not getting notifications, check that little thing over there as well, the little bell, and see how you're going. It's wonderful to have you here, and without any further ado, let's take it away, Steve.
Should the church apologise to the unvaccinated? The Evangelical Church in Australia has largely failed their members during the COVID pandemic in the sense of taking a very one-sided view of what happened. Humbly said, I believe the church at large failed their members in its response to COVID. This naturally does not apply to all congregations. This is just a general observation. Most churches appear to have blindly sided with the government and simply obeyed all the rules and mandates without too much consideration as to whether they were correct or whether there was real truth behind why they were to be done. Members who objected really had no place to go. There was no open dialogue. There was no room for questioning issues. Not in the sense that people couldn't, of course, question at home, but there was no place where people in the church could go who didn't share the same consensus or the same conclusion that the government and the church in that sense had. Now, that is all said and done, can the church really move on without any kind of review, follow-up, or dare I repeat it, apology for its silence? I'm not here taking sides with those who got the vaccine or those who did not. This is not the issue of this presentation. I will raise a number of facts and I will review a number of official statements by the wider church. All I am asking for is a degree of honesty, integrity, and introspection where this is needed. The reason why I'm putting this together as a presentation is simply because the unvaccinated have had no way of expressing their views inside the corporate church as such. All the articles and information that I will refer to in this presentation will be in the video description for you to follow up on, and I wholeheartedly recommend you do that. The integrity of the church is at stake. The church as a body of believers needs to have the integrity to admit when they have made a poor decision and or followed poor advice. Sometimes this should be followed by an apology. During the last 2 years, fear has been the driver of an avalanche of poor decisions that have been imposed onto citizens by force, with little respect to their civil liberties and individual rights. Sadly, the church at large has been silent. Data is now emerging that the Australian Prime Minister subverted the democratic processes in this country to increase his powers. He effectively became not only the Prime Minister, but 5 major ministerial roles, all wrapped up in one person. The idea here, of course, was that he could avoid parliamentary accountability, in his mind probably just because that's the only way he could solve the pandemic. But of course that's just in his mind. I'm not here questioning his motive. The question that one must ask is of legality and morality. It goes to the heart of the very constitutional foundations of our society. Incidentally, there are now calls for his resignation, which I would applaud. Now that the worst appears to be over and the truth is emerging, the big question that must be asked is, what are we as a society, and of course as a Christian, what are we as the church are going to do to ensure the same behaviours are not repeated? Many are calling for a royal commission into government responses, especially in relation to lockdowns and vaccine mandates that caused loss of livelihood on a grand scale. Now that we know that the vaccines are neither safe nor effective, certainly not to the degree that was claimed, and just as by way of reminder, Pfizer claimed, and this was the CEO of Pfizer, claimed initially that their vaccine was 100% effective. A ludicrous claim for all intents and purposes when you consider that in the broader range of different drugs that have been produced by the pharmaceutical industry, that is simply an anomaly to say that a drug is 100% effective. That is nonsense. I don't think there is a reputable scientist in the world who would say that would be true. The lockdowns caused more harm than they did good. Masking does not and did not limit the spread of the disease, and in many cases caused physical and psychological harm, especially to children and those with compromised immune systems. The removal of civil liberties was a violation of human and constitutional rights and charters. Public servants acted far outside their remit, and in reality they should be held accountable for the damage that was caused. The hard question is, why did the church not speak out? The church should be a voice of reason, a voice of counter pressure in society, a voice that holds the society in some way, shape or form to account, much like the media should be doing, and it did this neither. Why were they silent? This article is mainly directed at the church in relation to the COVID pandemic, not so much about the science and politics itself, but of course these do play a major role. References to scientific articles are added for the purpose of demonstrating the poor decisions and advice by the church. The all-important question is whether the church responded correctly, and if not, whether the church is therefore bound to admit its failure. Is there an ethical obligation to tell their congregants what they will do to avoid the same mistakes again? If in fact they believe they've made any, and I think this is where the problem starts. If not, how can the church members, as in those whose trust has been misused, how can they move on? History has an uncanny way of repeating itself. I have a keen interest in European history, having grown up in Germany. I spent 10 years of my childhood there. Germany produced some of the finest theologians and reformers. Yet, Germany also produced some of the most wicked tyrants. Sadly, the German church all but capitulated to the pressure during the Nazi regime. They acquiesced and all but gave up the fight against the onslaught of tyranny. Now, I'm not in any way, shape or form comparing Australia to Germany during the Second World War. So I'm not suggesting that politicians are Nazis or anything of that nature. The reason why I'm raising this issue is that the Nazis didn't become tyrants overnight. This happened over the course of an entire decade and more. Long before Hitler showed his true intent with the Holocaust, things started to go very wrong. So we're talking at least 10 years before the Second World War. It was when it was forbidden in German to do business with a Jew, or it was forbidden to sit on a park bench with a Jewish neighbor. This was when Jews were being castigated as dirty and disease-ridden. No scientific proof was required. This was all based on ideology, and a warped one at that. What is perhaps the worst of it all was that Germany was a highly educated nation, the envy of the Western world. In fact, in the late 20s, early 30s, many Western countries, including America, sent educational experts, academics to Germany to learn about the German education system. It was the envy of the world. Doctors, medical professionals, and nurses were amongst those who committed some of the worst atrocities during the Nazi era. Science was used as a pretense. The reason I raise this is because in most people's minds, people, when they think of their doctor and their nurse, they rightly think of people who are there who do morally right things, and it is by no means a necessary truth. Long before the concentration camps, there were homes for the disabled children, disabled adults, and in these homes they were given lethal dosages of drugs to eliminate them. Parents simply received a letter telling them that their child had tragically died of pneumonia. We live at a time when society is ridding itself of the shackles of all its traditional boundaries. Belief in God, the family, and traditional Christian sexual ethics are widely decried. The idea that God created male and female is called bigotry and hate speech these days. When voices of concern against the lockdowns, mask mandates, and vaccine mandates came from conservative groups in our society, and even though I believe there is evidence that these concerns came from a cross-section of society, and we will see that later, the media jumped to conclude that those who are protesting are simply extremists and conspiracy theorists. Some media outlets labeled them as domestic terrorists. They became the other of the COVID period. Anglican apologist Glenn Peoples from New Zealand, who, by the way, was an advocate for the vaccine, so it's important to note that, did a great job at debunking the myths propagated by the New Zealand media on who are those people that are protesting. Contrary to the messaging emanating from Jacinda Ardern that they can all be ignored because they are extremists, they're not good citizens who deserve to be heard, would be the message you'd get from Jacinda. All tyrannical governments have one thing in common. They paint a picture of the other, that ugly enemy that is to be cancelled, labelled, and best locked up somewhere safe, so the good citizens can get on with their life in safety. For the Germans, the other was the Jew. For the governments of the COVID era, the other was the unvaccinated. Glenn Peoples writes, "Who are the protesters? Forget whatever derogatory terms you might want to use to answer that question. Who are they? What are they? I've heard some remarks that would describe them as far-right extremists or racists who want to take down the government. But that's a ridiculous lie. The movement consists of left-wing naturopaths as much as it consists of right-wing anything. In fact, recent survey results over at The Platform reveal that when it comes to protesters, most recent voting records, the largest group voted for Labour. All told, about half the people who voted did so for a party on the left." Melbourne police resorted to pepper spraying old ladies, shooting rubber bullets into the backups of protesters, peaceful protesters, mind you, bullying, throwing peace-loving people to the ground with police violence, never seen before in this country. The same could be said of the police forces of most states in this land. We had premiers having fits of anger on TV, calling anyone who questions any of the government measures outright anti-vaxxers, even if they were double vaccinated. The picture of the Premier of the Northern Territory spewing anger will stick in many of our minds for a long time. The only kind of response to all this tyrannical government overreach the church at large could muster is exemplified in an article by the Gospel Coalition. The article refers to a tweet from a conservative commentator, Candace Owens, in the US. Candace writes, "Looking into what is happening in Australia, and I can now confidently say that World War III is upon us. We're in the midst of a global psychological warfare. Under the guise of COVID-19, governments worldwide have declared war on their people for full totalitarian control." The article goes on to respond. Evidently, she was referring to the lockdown regulations in parts of Sydney and Melbourne and the clash of protesters and police. Now, I think there's a meaningful conversation to be had about lockdowns, civil liberties, and police tactics. But is Australia an example of World War III, global psychological warfare, governments declaring war on their people for full totalitarian control? Question mark is what the article asks. Whilst I, this is me, agree that the comment about World War III is a far stretch, the idea of psychological warfare and declaring war on its people is hardly wrong. What else would you call it when in Canberra the police on the steps of the Parliament House roll out an electronic device called an LRAD, which is meant to send signals, radio frequencies, dangerous radio frequencies, into a crowd that is in front of the Parliament, peacefully protesting there, that are known to mess with people's brainwaves and possibly do them physical harm? What else would you call it when helicopters are flying around city suburbs at low height in search of citizens who have breached a so-called COVID dictate? When mothers are out for a walk with their children and have to somehow prove to a police officer turned bully as to why they are out and how far they were from their home, when thousands of businesses and livelihoods were destroyed, when people were literally pushed to the brink of suicide, and bear in mind that many did actually commit suicide, what else would you call this other than psychological warfare? Read the article for yourself. There is nothing in this article that gives a meaningful admission that the lockdowns were extremely destructive. The article just tries to ameliorate the situation as if the government had done nothing wrong and deserved the full support of the church. Hundreds of scientific journal articles by reputable medical professionals have been written proving that the lockdowns were a complete failure. I know this is across the world. Even the WHO, prior to COVID, had always recommended against lockdowns. Not only did they have no meaningful effect on the disease itself, but the collateral damage in their wake will be felt for decades to come. Even the mainstream media is now admitting as much. Why are the politicians who did this not held to account? Why was the church silent and just went along with all this? Why was there no public outcry from church leaders? Church ministers abusing their influence. John Piper is perhaps one of the most influential figures in the world of evangelical churches today. On his site, desiringgod.org, he wrote an article calling for believers to be vaccinated. Sadly, he resorted to very poor and one-sided arguments. They've all been proven wrong. John wrote, "Before I get to the biblical argument for radical freedom, consider a few statistics that fuel the fire over which this article was cooked. Nearly all COVID-19 deaths in the US are now in people who are vaccinated." It's interesting to note that even now, by now, the CDC has distanced itself from this and has recognized this was a myth and a totally unsubstantiated claim. John then cites a number of statistics aiming to show that COVID was a disease of the unvaccinated. Has been proven wrong. He then proceeds to give the idea that those who are not getting vaccinated are only doing this because they don't want to be seen in the woke left group, i.e. they are being peer pressured against all the facts to not get vaccinated. Now this may be true, of course, of some people, but it is by no means true of a lot of people. If you only ever read this article by John, you'd think this is done and dusted. Even though he mentions the ethical issues, we will get to those, he still lands on the idea that the facts are all on the side of vaccination. He sadly even retorts to using the typical strawman argument from conspiracy theory. Eventually, the CDC had to admit that the idea that COVID is a disease of the unvaccinated was a pure fabrication, with no evidence to prove it. John continues, "Your conscience is increasingly clear," it says, "get vaccinated." Again, this may be true of some people, but by no means all. James White, a prolific Christian apologetics debater, did an excellent review of John Piper's article. I shall leave you to work out who did the better job. The article references are in the video description. Whilst I have always admired John Piper's ministry, this article was a real letdown in terms of any meaningful attempt to engage with both sides of this issue. If there is one thing that has been demonstrated over and over again in the last 3 years, it is that mainstream media and politicians are quite happy to outright lie in order to get their message across. We have seen an unprecedented level of censorship by big tech companies. Why did the church blindly follow along with all this, without a hint of any question? It is especially alarming when that hammer of censorship was brought down on scientists who contradict the narrative pushed by Big Pharma, and those tied up with their financial interests. The world has come to elevate a college dropout called Bill Gates, who, by the way, has no medical or scientific qualifications at all. We've elevated him to this godlike status when it comes to health advice. And of course, in the meantime, Bill Gates has made tens of billions of dollars from the pandemic, and yet equally, hundreds of millions of people have been pushed back below the poverty line during this pandemic. The world needs to judge those pushing woke social justice by their results, not their words. The old quote, "Lies, damned lies, and statistics," is so true. My advice would be to listen to someone on the other side of your narrative or your argument. The narrative that has been force-fed through the media has the definite ring of cultism to it, given its one-sidedness and the absolute blackout of all dissenting voices on big tech platforms. Professor of Mathematics Dr. Norman Fenton did a great job of pulling back the veneer behind government statistics. In the UK, as confirmed in a recent documentary by the BBC, the official percentage of vaccinated people is 92% versus the 8% unvaccinated. That, however, depends on which data set you analyse. Interestingly, the BBC engaged with an independent survey company to get a snapshot of the percentages for their documentary. The survey demonstrated a totally different picture, namely that of 26% unvaccinated, and the official government, as stated earlier, is 8%. So they concluded their survey simply had to be wrong, and hence the numbers were quietly adjusted. You will only get that when you look at the data and all the small print. Effectively, the BBC is engaged in subverting the truth to push their narrative. The all-important issue here is that governments have consistently given out misleading information. Many of their estimates were based on modelling that later proved to be totally wrong and in the order of magnitudes wrong. Often statistics were based on miscategorizing data. When this was proven, agencies sometimes made corrections, but these corrections never made it onto the mainstream media platforms and the ordinary citizen never heard of them. It appears there is simply too much money involved in this whole mess. Trust the science, we are told. This is like a new religious mantra, when traditionally science was never settled. Hasn't one of the main pillars of science always been to constantly question things? Now, the science is encapsulated in a person, the person of Tony Fauci. He calls himself the science. I think that is patently ridiculous on the one hand, and actually quite dangerous on the other. Ethics of vaccines. How could the church get the ethics of the COVID vaccines so wrong? Here are a few comments from an article, again by the Gospel Coalition of Australia, on the ethics of the vaccines. Aborted fetal tissue was used in either the making or the testing of all the main COVID vaccines. Even though this was contested by the companies initially, eventually this truth had to be admitted. The Gospel Coalition wrote, "My own view is that the key consideration in whether using a vaccine which is manufactured using tissue from an aborted fetus is illicit or immoral is whether there is material cooperation with the evil act of abortion. If the abortion were conducted in order to harvest tissues that were to be used for the vaccine, then it would clearly be immoral." Note this is important. But in the case of COVID-19 vaccines created from the HEC293 cell line, the abortion was carried out for other reasons, and the tissue was acquired after the child's death for the purpose of medical research. The use of the vaccine now will not promote further abortions for this particular purpose, and it can therefore be argued that we are not morally complicit in the original abortion. That's the Gospel Coalition quote. I have two concerns with this comment here. Firstly, the indication from this context is that the research in question only relied on a single abortion. I have included references, and in the references there is a 9-hour deposition of one of the main scientists who was involved with, and in fact he was the lead scientist in most of this early abortion fetal tissue research work. If you took the time to listen, you would realize the facts lie somewhere else. What we are told by the Gospel Coalition is not the whole truth. Far from it. Firstly, as I said, the indication from the context is that the research in question only relied on a single abortion. And there is no mention of the barbaric practice of removing the tissue from the baby while it is alive. Ponder that for a moment, because that is what occurs. Which clearly indicates that abortions are in fact carried out for the very purpose of harvesting organs. I've included, as I said, a multi-hour recording of a legal deposition of one of the main scientists involved with the development of aborted fetal tissue strains. Listening to him is like listening to an account of one of the doctors from Auschwitz. I can't help thinking that Big Pharma has too much to lose, and they have worked hard to suppress this information from the eye of the public. Here are two statements from doctors and professionals who were present during such barbaric acts. If you search, you will find many more. It gets really ugly, and once you have opened Pandora's box, humbly said, I think, you cannot close it again. One of the statements said, experiments were being performed on near-term alive aborted babies who were not even afforded the mercy of an anesthetic as they writhed and cried in agony. When their usefulness had expired, they were executed and discarded as garbage. Another statement said the NIH grant application for just one of the University I've deliberately omitted the name, numerous experiments with aborted infants reads like an episode of American Horror Story. Infants in the womb, some old enough to be viable, are being aborted alive and killed for organ harvesting in order to bring in millions of dollars in taxpayer funding for the name deliberately omitted and the abortion business it supports. Please bear in mind that Francis Collins, the chief of the NIH, claims to be a Christian. Now, I don't doubt he's a Christian, but I find this very, very difficult to swallow. Ponder on this for a moment, please. Neither of these two statements, I think, require further comment by me. What disappointed me most by the article by the Gospel Coalition is the one-sided presentation. The opposing view is not even given a hearing. Did the author ever really investigate further? It seems to me they've just trusted what the pharma industry has given out, and of course they've only given out a very small fraction of the truth. Did the author just believe whatever the pharma company representatives said? If I can find this information on the internet, then why did they not? Sadly, many believers give organizations like the Gospel Coalition their implicit trust. This trust, I believe, has been violated. Here is another argument made by the Gospel Coalition in favor of the vaccine. Another way to consider the situation is to compare it with organ transplant. If the only available organ for a life-saving transplant is donated by a murder victim, we do not consider that in accepting the organ that we are approving of murder. In the same way, if we have no alternative to a certain vaccine produced using tissue from the children killed over 50 years ago, we are not necessarily condoning abortion. Now that sounds good on the surface, but the logic is false. Given that organ trafficking is a criminal offence in Australia, one would have to assume that the author is referring to the murder victim having given permission for his or her organs to be harvested. In this case, I can see no reason to reject such an offer, even for the scientific research. The cardinal difference between a murder victim and the aborted baby is that the baby never gave permission for its organs to be harvested, never mind agreeing to be murdered in the process, or worst of all, those organs to be harvested while the baby, equals the murder victim, was still alive. Now, I believe there would be a public outcry if we were to harvest the organs from a murderer while the murderer is still alive. Yet we turn a blind eye when this very thing is done to a baby. Wouldn't you agree? Ponder on this for a moment. The failure in this ethical argument should be plain to see. The Gospel Coalition argued further. It could be argued that to refuse vaccination in the event that only an unethical COVID-19 vaccine were available would also be wrong, as it increases the risk of prolonging the pandemic and is not a loving way to treat our neighbour. It appears now in hindsight that this argument was a complete failure. Asymptomatic spread of the disease has never been proven. And in fact, multiple studies exist that have debunked this myth, widely propagated by government leaders of the world. Very early on in the pandemic, long before vaccines were available, a large study involving nearly 1 million participants in China demonstrated that asymptomatic spread of the disease does not occur or is so negligible that it has no bearing on the pandemic. Given the vaccines do not prevent transmission, and therefore the idea that they would prevent or end the pandemic has been proven false. Why did the church at large side with the government? One could surely accept that when the initial mantra of 15 days to flatten the curve was heard on every news station, we could all be excused for going along. Within the first few months, however, the government messaging was changing at a rapid rate. The church at large naturally does not refer to everyone, was silent. They just complied. Is that because of a theological position dictated by Scripture? I do believe there has been misconception of Paul's intent in his letter to the Romans, chapter 13. That, however, cannot answer for everything. Churches at large agree that only God has absolute authority. We all believe in some kind of boundary. Where we are not in agreement is where to draw this boundary. In order to know where to draw the boundary between obedience to healthy forms of authority and disobedience to tyranny, open discussion must be fostered in an atmosphere where questions can be asked without fear. Clearly this did not happen. If it is still not happening, how can we be certain the same errors won't be repeated? Denominations largely dictated from the top down how local churches and their ministers and members were to act. That's it. Job done. Sadly, that was entirely insufficient and has caused much distress. In some cases, this has resulted in so much distrust towards the church that members and families have uprooted in search of another place of worship, one that will address these issues with a degree of openness and honesty. Things ordinary church members never heard from their ministers. There were, in fact, Australian medical professionals who spoke out against the government narrative, often at loss of their reputation and even license to practice medicine. The TGA engaged in the shameful practice of gagging doctors into silence. And if you don't believe me, follow up. The TGA sent a letter early in the pandemic silencing every doctor in this country. Doctors were not permitted to give medical advice to their patients that contradicted a government narrative. One would expect this sort of practice from a totalitarian regime, but here in Australia? For an example, there was a conference run by concerned Catholics, with many doctors, scientists, medical professionals calling to stop the shots. As a reminder, I've included all the reference in the video description. Neil Chambers from the Gospel Coalition writes, "The healthy who can get vaccinated should get vaccinated to protect the more vulnerable. Further community-wide vaccination will help limit the development of new, potentially more dangerous strains of the virus by decreasing the amount of virus multiplying in the community." Apart from the glaring issues with this article, some of which I have answered earlier, this statement has also proven to be false. An acclaimed vaccinologist, one who used to work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in a groundbreaking interview warned the scientific community that the vaccination program is the thing that is putting the pressure on the virus to mutate and possibly create more deadly strains. Now, of course, I'm not a scientist, so I can't say whether one side of this argument is true versus the other. But what I am objecting to is the silencing of one view so that we only hear the other. According to government data, Australia is now roughly 90% double vaccinated. Of course, thinking about the UK and their subversion of those figures, who knows what those figures really are here in Australia. Yet we are seeing some of the worst surges in COVID disease numbers. The only response we hear to get is, take yet another vaccine, get boosted. Traditionally, vaccines were, you took the vaccine so that you don't get the disease. Now, you take the vaccine, you get the disease anyway, and the only response is take another vaccine. I mean, how do we make sense of this? Leaders and celebrities are publicly claiming they have been quadruple vaccinated, and yet some have had several bouts of the disease this year alone. To make things even worse, they are heaping praise on the vaccine. In my humble estimation, this sounds more like insanity than rationality. Safe and effective. One of the big claims by the CDC on safety was that the spike protein would stay in the arm, the injection site, your muscle. That our cells would break it down within a few days. Back in March 2021, not long after the massive vaccination drive started, studies like one in Nature.com showed that in previous animal trials, the spike protein crossed the blood-brain barrier. This is commonly known to be a major red flag in drug trials. Those who are raising serious concerns about the COVID vaccine safety had every right to be concerned. Major trials in Japan showed that this was actually occurring. We heard nothing. Fact checkers who are largely funded by Big Pharma, i.e. have financial conflicts of interest, got into a frenzy to try and debunk this as a myth. You need to judge for yourself whether this was a risk worth taking. The trouble is, how can you know you're taking a risk when no one tells you this is happening? One thing is certainly true, the concerns of the unvaccinated were certainly not based on hearsay or conspiracies. Such arguments are just a distraction and do nothing to further the truth. Interestingly, even the CDC has now backpedaled on the claim that the effects of the vaccine remain at the injection site. Contrary to their initial statements, studies have demonstrated that the effects end up all over the body, in the liver, the spleen, the sexual reproductive organs, and worst of all, in the brain. Sadly, once again, the Gospel Coalition in Australia kept banging on the government drum. It's safe and effective. At the very least, the Gospel Coalition needs to do an honest review of the messages they pushed. They need to admit squarely they were wrong. It was wrong to push the government narrative to their audience, knowing that many would implicitly trust their advice. They need to apologise, else the trust that has been eroded cannot be restored. Cancer rates are through the roof and we deserve answers. This stat graph here is from the CDC in the US. Cancer rates went through the roof in 2021, the year of vaccination, Whereas in 2020, was COVID without vaccination did not show this rise. So in 2020, we had these massive numbers of COVID. This is, of course, in the US. The cancer rates didn't go through the roof in 2020, but they went through the roof in 2021. The graphic in the slide is from the CDC in the USA, as I said. It is the trend of cancer rates from 2014 to 2022. If one compares the stats of 2020 and 2021, the sole and major difference, the major one, I'm not suggesting there aren't others, between these 2 years is the vaccination. It's hard to see how COVID is the driver of this huge increase in cancer rates, as it did not occur in 2020, when COVID was rampant and there were no vaccines. Yes, I do know correlation is not causation. But at the very least, the medical and political community, who have been the drivers behind the COVID response, owe to us to do a thorough investigation. The citizens of this world deserve answers. What is pushing this alarming increase in cancer? In summary, the concerns of the so-called unvaccinated, and hence their desire for some degree of honesty and transparency from the church, the 5 following points, I think, are a summary of what many believe to be wrong from the outset. And humbly said, I think they have all been but vindicated, as finally even organizations like the CDC are beginning to admit. The virus is not spread asymptomatically. Testing people without symptoms only drives fear and compliance. Natural immunity is robust and long-lasting. COVID-19 is easily treatable at home with conventional medicines. The COVID vaccines, i.e. Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca, they have all failed. We were told they were nearly 100% effective. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, is on record as stating that in early 2021, the vaccine is 100% effective. Governments and media around the world now admit that vaccines do not prevent transmission, they do not prevent disease. At best, they prevent severe disease, and even this is questionable, since the vaccine efficacy wears off in a matter of mere weeks, or maybe 1 to 2 months. Do they really expect people will line up every 3 months for a jab that does not work? The vaccine adverse events reporting systems around the world have reported more events on the COVID vaccines in the last 18 months than all vaccines combined in the last 30 years. At best, this means these vaccines carry nearly 100 times more risk than any other vaccine did before. Those who had concerns from the start have most assuredly been vindicated. It's important to understand that the vaccine adverse event reporting system, this is in the US, there is a similar system here in Australia, there is such a system in Europe, and there is another one in the UK. In the US, this was created because in 1986, the US Congress signed in a law that gave vaccine manufacturers immunity from prosecution. So people couldn't go to the vaccine manufacturer and take them to court over a product that did them damage. So the US naturally needed to provide some way of at least gathering information about who is hurt, who has had their health damaged. So this system was created for that fact. So when people complain and say, oh, well, it's a useless system, well, that's the system the American government created for the very purpose, because they are the ones who gave the companies like Pfizer immunity from prosecution. You can't have your cake and eat it. You have to live up to the fact. This is the vaccine reporting system we've got. And the reality is also that it is very hard work to create. Apparently, it takes over 45 minutes of hard work together with a medical professional in the US to create such a report. And most of the reports are created by either nurses or doctors. So the idea that this would be vastly wrong, if anything, most professionals who have investigated this system think that it is vastly underreporting. As I said, it was created after all vaccine manufacturers were given immunity from prosecution by law under the Reagan administration in 1986. The government created this reporting system. Each report is usually done by a doctor or nurse. It's very complicated. Each report is vetted by the government agency responsible for the database as well. During the swine flu vaccination, not that long ago, I believe that was in 2009, roughly 100 million people were vaccinated, so quite a large number. The vaccines were pulled from the market when theirs reported 50 deaths. I'll repeat that. The vaccines were pulled from the market when theirs reported 50 deaths. In 2021, in the US alone, more than 10,000 VAERS reported deaths occurred. Now, I, of course, don't know whether each one of those has been proven to be true, but a certain percentage of them most certainly are caused by the vaccine. A large percentage of these are deaths that occur within the first 2 days after vaccination, some within the first week, the first 2 weeks. The graph shows that in 2021, the 3 COVID vaccines caused more vaccine adverse event reports than all 80-odd vaccines in the US schedule since 1986, i.e. 35 years. This is staggering. This is like, imagine you had in your house not just one smoke alarm, but 100 smoke alarms, and they're all going off at the same time, and you say nothing's wrong here, there's no fire. How is it possible these vaccines are still being pushed at the rate that they are? I shall conclude with a sermon, or more an open chat discussion by an Anglican minister from Sydney that goes to the heart of this issue, and I would strongly recommend you listen to it. You'll get a different perspective from him, but I think he did a thorough job early in the piece, looking at all the hard facts and being very, very open and frank with his congregation. Here is a man who has openly talked with his congregation, and I think he handled it really well, and I think each minister of a church in Australia could take a slice from his way of handling it. And I sincerely believe that the church has a duty of care to handle situations like that openly. In summary, the church should have done more research work instead of blindly following government and media. The church should have fostered open debate amongst its members. The church should not have presented just one side of an argument, or nothing at all. Largely the church was just silent and went along with the government dictates. Health decisions should be made between a person and their doctor, not between the person, the church minister, the government. Church ministers could have been a voice of reason and a voice of weight against the government overreach, the authoritarian handling of lockdowns, masks, and vaccine mandates. When we saw these terrible pictures of police in Melbourne shooting at the back of peaceful protesters, there was no one in the church who even voiced any kind of concern. Nothing. There was just silence. The church cannot afford to be silent in moments of this nature. The church owes their members an apology, and the church, I believe, must demonstrate that it has learned a vital lesson so that we can ensure that the country, at least the church, does not fall into the same trap again.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. It's been great to have you here on this video today. And again, if you aren't subscribed, please consider subscribing, and we look forward to seeing you on future videos. By the way, if you have subscribed, please feel free to send us any messages and requests for other videos or topics that you'd like us to cover. Details for how to stay in touch with our mailing list and things are down below in the description. And again, wonderful to have you here. We pray God's richest blessing on you and your family in Jesus' name. Amen.